David, you've written that you think globalization is changing. It's not ending, but the world is not de-globalizing. So how is it changing? And what does it mean for us?
Yes, I mean, there's a kind of a common line in the commentariat that the process of globalization over the last few decades is now going into reverse. It's unwinding as kind of countries retrench and become protectionist and the like. To me, that's not evident in the data. It's certainly clear if you look at a measure like world trade to GDP, that ran up very strongly from, let's say, the early 90s to about the global financial crisis 15 years back. And since then, it's kind of roughly speaking moved sideways. So that's not as strong as it was prior to the global financial crisis, but neither is there really any evidence that it's unwinding. What I think is happening is that we are seeing a more regional and political version of global flows, by which I mean, rather than having far-flung supply chains with production made in, for example, low-cost East Asian markets for consumption in Europe or the US, we're seeing supply chains becoming much more localized. That's partly a response to the pandemic and concerns around supply chain resilience and not being exposed to physical disruptions like the Suez Canal being closed or a pandemic. So you want to have production and consumption a bit closer to each other, but also measures of kind of geopolitical de-risking. So Janet Yellen, US Treasury Secretary, talks about friendshoring, the notion of undertaking trade and investment with countries who are in some way friends or with whom you are aligned. Those partners are often more kind of geographically proximate within Europe, for example. So we are seeing a reconfiguration of flows. They're becoming much more localized. But we're also seeing politics play a much more significant shaping role in terms of who does trade with whom. So just a couple of observations. If you look at Chinese exports and imports, trade with the ASEANs, trade with the BRICS grouping are growing quite strongly. Trade with Japan, Korea, the US is going into reverse. Similarly, if you look at US imports, the US now imports more from Mexico than it does from China. So we are seeing, gradually, it's fair to say, but we are seeing a reorientation of those trade and investment flows around kind of geopolitical affinity and less a straight commercial calculus. So we are going to see goods and services rather continue to be traded across borders. It's very difficult to get that genie back in the bottle because global flows matter enormously for welfare. But the nature of those flows, what they look like physically, I think is shifting. And so for countries like New Zealand, small countries very reliant on global markets, that has implications in terms of where we source our goods and services from, where we attract capital from, and I think we need to be prepared to kind of reposition, our trading and investing relationships as other countries are doing as well.
Mm. And there's also the existential threat to us of the way the high-value Western markets read the climate crisis, right? You hear a lot more talk about, we should be buying food that we're growing locally. We shouldn't be traveling long distances. I recall many years ago having lunch with prominent UK commentators, and one of them said, well, Prime Minister, your country's economy is stuffed, isn't it? And I said, excuse me. And he said, look, no one's going to want to fly there, and they're not going to want to eat food that comes 12,000 miles. So that, just at the headline level, I think is an existential threat to us unless the sustainability story is pretty good. Would you agree?
I think there are real risks. I mean, that the shape of New Zealand's export profile is highly exposed to shifting preferences around the emissions intensity, or indeed changing measures around carbon pricing or regulation, because our, at least pre-pandemic, the two biggest export categories we have were international tourism and dairy, both of which, particularly long-haul tourism and dairy, have significant emissions intensity around them. So, I think there are significant exposures that New Zealand export base has. Now, consumer preferences are shifting, but not shifting overnight, and it's going to be a gradual process. And obviously, there are technical debates around how New Zealand's emissions intensity of horticultural or agriculture more broadly compares with goods produced close to consumer. So food miles can be a slightly misleading debate. But the point is, if you look at dairy, you look at red meat, you look at tourism, all of those have significant embedded emissions. And it's not only that consumer preferences are shifting or that carbon pricing is coming on stream, but also there are new technologies around artificial proteins, precision fermentation and the like. So I think New Zealand needs to begin to grapple much more seriously with how we begin to meet shifting consumer preferences and the extent to which we, if you like, future-proof our export profile. So if these consumer preferences do continue to shift, or if new technologies come on stream, that we've got some new growth engines. And given New Zealand's scientific base and capabilities around the agricultural sector, we should be ahead of the curve on this stuff. I'm not convinced that we are, and I think we need to take this a lot more seriously.